And that was what ended up driving me towards ultimately getting a PhD at Yale in literature, because I had this wacky idea that if you studied people like Shakespeare, you could understand how imagination and emotion worked.
How did you sell that to the Yale English department?
So this is a terrible story. And first of all, I should be honest and say that after Yale admitted me, they then tried to de-admit me after a year because, they were so horrified because I literally acted like a scientist the entire time I was there. And there was this kind of sense that I was this sort of like deranged Philistine who had somehow broken his way into the Yale English department and was constantly trying to like anatomize things. I mean, there was almost a sense that there was something inappropriate about it.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
I'm pleased to be joined today in the ASC Tech Studios by Angus Fletcher, professor of English at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. He studies literature's usefulness, treating it as a practical tool for alleviating poverty, hunger, heartbreak, and other physical concerns by employing a range of empirical methods, from ancient rhetoric to modern science. Dr. Fletcher, welcome to Voices.
I could not be more thrilled to be here.
And I'm thrilled that you're here. I usually ask this question later in the interview, but I was just so taken by your journey to a PhD in literature. And I wonder if you'd tell us where you began. I think it was in a neurophysiology lab somewhere.
It was, yes, at the school up north. So I worked in neurophysiology at the University of Michigan Medical School. And neurophysiology basically just means studying how one brain cell talks to another.
Was this your degree? Was your background in neuroscience?
Yeah, so it's a very specific field of neuroscience is neurophysiology. It's literally the mechanics. If you think of the brain as a kind of machine, all the different parts and how they work and how they connect and how electricity and chemicals all come together to make the brain function. And I was very fortunate. I got to work for 4 years in this lab. And I was also fortunate that I was able to personally identify a small mechanism that helps determine when neurons decide to communicate with other neurons.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
So basically, without getting into enormous detail, the neuron, it's like a little wire, electric charge runs down it, but then this weird thing happens at the end of the neuron, which is that all of a sudden chemicals are released. And those chemicals jump the gap, the synapse between one neuron and the other, and then they get that other neuron to fire an electric charge. This turns out to be very important in terms of understanding things like story thinking and narrative cognition, which I work in, but the human brain is a mixed electric and chemical machine. And the question has always been, well, when that electric charge gets to the bottom, how are the chemicals released? How do they know to go? And it turns out there are these little vesicles, little storage pods that hold the neurotransmitter, and they're docked, waiting to go. But then another protein has to come in and phosphorylate them and get them to release the chemicals. And so I worked on what those proteins were that helped to launch the release of the neurotransmitter.
What brought you to neuroscience? Is this something that you wanted to do since you were a kid?
So the human brain is a very interesting thing. And I think, like a lot of people, I first started out wondering about other people's brains because it's pretty obvious that pretty much everyone I encountered was nuts. And I was like, what's going on in their heads? Why are they thinking these ways? And then I started to think about it. I realized that I was also just a little bit nuts. And I started to wonder, how is it that this thing operates? Because it has such enormous potential, but it's also so prone to quirks and misfires and doing just very odd and very peculiar things. It has the capacity for huge imagination to see the future at times. But then it also has this capacity to short circuit, to be dragged sideways by weird rogue emotions, to malfunction, to harm others. And I think, like a lot of people, I just thought, well, so much of life is driven by how humans behave, and so much of how humans behave is driven by how humans think. And so if I could just understand a little bit more about that, and I could kind of help us all understand how to use more this thing in our head. So that was kind of my dream when I was younger, and I just wanted to understand the mechanics and machinery about it in an objective way. And that's what drew me into neuroscience. And then that's ultimately what drew me out of neuroscience.
What do you mean by that? Drew you out of it?
So one of the things I realized working in the neuroscience lab, and I think this will be a common experience for most people working in science, is that you survive as a scientist by identifying an area that you can rapidly get grants for. So basically, you want to get money for your lab. And the way that you get money for your lab is you identify an area where you're very effective at publishing. And you sort of chalk off your tiny corner of things, and you get really, really good, and you train a bunch of students to get really, really good. And it usually involves a technique or a method that other labs don't have access to that allows you to make rapid gains. So in the case of the lab that I worked in, we did something called patch clamping. And patch clamping, I won't go into the technical details of it, but it basically just allows you to measure when individual neurons are firing. And so we were able to make these huge advances and do a lot of really exciting things in this very tiny area. But I wanted to ask bigger questions, and I wanted to connect these small things. And so my heroes in science were people like Marie Curie or Charles Darwin. Darwin is able to take a few tiny observations about these birds on an island in the middle of nowhere. And
finches, I believe, right?
Galapagos finches, yes. And just rethink everything. And so I think at a certain point as a scientist, you start to want to make that turn between these very small mechanisms and the larger consequences. And so I just started to realize that if that was the direction that I wanted to go, I had to learn more about other things. And in particular, I wanted to understand things like how emotion worked, how imagination worked, how creativity worked, how all these things function in the brain. And I just saw that the way that they were being treated in contemporary psychology didn't seem rich enough or adequate enough to really get at the bigness. And that was what ended up driving me towards ultimately getting a PhD at Yale in literature, because I had this wacky idea that if you studied people like Shakespeare, you could understand how imagination and emotion worked.
How did you sell that to the Yale English department?
So this is a terrible story. And first of all, I should be honest and say that after Yale admitted me, they then tried to de-admit me after a year because they were so horrified, because I literally acted like a scientist the entire time I was there. And there was this kind of sense that I was this sort of like deranged Philistine who had somehow broken his way into the Yale English department and was constantly trying to like anatomize things. I mean, there was almost a sense that there was something inappropriate about it. Like I was taking Shakespeare and forcing him into a brain scanner or trying to anatomize his neuromachinery. The way that I did it is I hacked my way in. So as someone who is a young person trained in science, I had this real ability to take tests. And I was trained from a young age to be really, really good at figuring out how to score well on tests, even if I didn't even understand the tests that well. And so to get into English graduate school, you had to take something called the GRE, which tested you on all of literature. And so what I did, having no knowledge of literature whatsoever, because I had this background in neuroscience and no training in literature, is I got all the old copies of the GRE that I could find. And then I didn't even bother to study them except to circle all the works of literature that were either in the questions or the answers. And then I got 1- and 2-sentence summaries of all those works of literature and memorized them. That was literally the extent of my knowledge of English literature. And then I went in and I got a perfect score on this test. And the English department looked at me and they said, oh my goodness, this guy has this neuroscience background and he apparently knows everything in the history of literature. He must be amazing. And then I got into a classroom and they realized that I knew nothing about literature at all. And I had just hacked my way in, and that took a long period of time for each of us to adjust to each other. I had to learn how to read literature like a literature person, and they had to learn how to accept this science person into their midst.
Read literature like a literature person. What does that mean?
Well, it means to read it not like a computer. So the way that you think about literature, if you're a scientist, at least the way that I did, is I thought about it as words and data and things to be analyzed. So I thought about it as there are all these titles. I have to memorize the titles. I have to memorize who's in the stories. I have to remember what the ending of the story is. I have to learn what the story means. I have to learn what the themes and representations of the story are. I have to upload all this data in my head, and then I have to be able to regurgitate it rapidly. And the Yale English department was like, no. Actually, you have to be able to experience Hamlet and wrestle with what's going on in Hamlet, and you have to think about what was the theater like then? Who was coming to watch these plays? What were the actors themselves? What was the performance like? You have to think about all these things. You have to think, what was Shakespeare himself? What did he read? And why did he write these plays? And what were his human motivations? And it just opened up all this complexity. It allowed me to think about things like imagination and emotion, but it also made it very challenging because once you start thinking about things in that level of specificity, how do you abstract out of that? How do you do the kinds of things that you would love to do as a scientist and come up with a simple, exact answer?
I would love to talk about your first book, Wonderworks, Literary Invention and the Science of Stories. And boy, there's a lot to unpack there. Start with literary invention. What do you mean by that?
Well, the first thing I just want to say is that literature is itself an invention.
Literature is an invention, okay?
So, and the reason I say that is because there is sometimes a tendency, if you read popular works on literature and how they work, if you read something like Joseph Campbell on The Hero's Journey, which everyone reads in Hollywood, you'll have this idea that somehow there are these archetypes which have existed forever. Mm-hmm. And no, it's very important that at a certain period of time, humans invented the love song. It didn't exist before, and it did something different. Humans invented the detective novel. The detective novel didn't exist until the middle of the 19th century. Humans invented the romance. Humans invented all of these things. And that tells you a couple of really important things. The first is that humans did this for a reason. We always invent tools and technology for a reason. We're struggling with something, and that's why we create medicines. That's why we create spaceships, is they help us in some way wrestle and find answers to things we're wrestling with. And in the case of literature, what it's really helping us do is solve the problem of our own brain. The other reason it's important to think about literature as an invention is to encourage people to realize that there's room to invent more. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I think that a lot of big dreamers, particularly young students, when they think about, well, where would I go to change the world? They might think about politics, they might think about technology, but how many of them think, I'm going to create a new form of literature that's going to change everything? But the reality is that has happened again and again in history. The work of literature has been invented, and it shifted everything. And I just wanted to encourage students to realize that they have this power just with a pen and a piece of paper to shift the whole way the world works, because you can invent a kind of story that no one else has ever heard before.
So what problem was solved by the detective story?
In the case of the detective story, how do you solve mysteries? For a long time, people had thought the only way to solve a mystery was to ask an expert or to ask an authority or to accept that the mystery was never going to be solved. So the original mystery plays are religious plays. And the point is that you can't know the mystery. You read the Bible and you don't understand. And you're only going to understand the next life. But in the 19th century, there's this movement to make science a daily practice. And one of the things we don't realize now, because science has become professionalized, is that many of the great scientific discoveries of the 19th century were made by amateurs. And there was this huge move for everyone to learn to think like a scientist. Well, what does that mean to think like a scientist? It means you have to find answers to problems, and you have to find new ways of approaching those problems. You have to be a detective of nature, a detective of psychology. And it's very easy to jump to bad answers. I mean, it's very easy to do bad science and say, oh, vaccines cause autism or whatever. There's a long history of people who have been very, very convinced by their ideas. But to do good science means that you have to take a very tiny piece of information and then make bold predictions off it and then test those predictions and see do those work and constantly be testing your predictions, testing and testing. And so early detective fiction is fascinating because it involves Edgar Allan Poe's we think is the first person to write a detective story. Oh. It involves small clues that then lead to bold hypotheses, bold jumps, bold narrative jumps, something that a computer couldn't do, and then testing them and seeing do they hold up. And it's that combination of identifying small significant clues and then making big imaginative leaps that powers really good detective fiction and that produced big thinking scientists that drove the 19th century. So that's an example. It's a simple example, but detective fiction is one of the driving forces, I think, behind why the way so many people naturally think like scientists now, because we don't do a great job of teaching it in school, if I'm honest. We teach a lot of facts in school, but to actually be a detective, you get that from reading Sherlock Holmes.
When you say science of stories, or you sometimes describe yourself as a story scientist, what does that mean?
This is a great question. Well, I have to be honest and say that I just totally made the term up. And I mostly made the term up because I kept being asked to talk.
You invented it.
I did. That's right. That's exactly right. That's the generous reading of it. I kept being asked to talk about this science of story over and over and over again. And so finally it just got complicated. And to constantly be like, well, I do neurophysiology and narrative theory, and I'm going to talk about the science of story. So I just thought, well, I'll just say that I'm a story scientist. In my particular meaning of it, it simply means that I combine narrative theory, which is something that Ohio State is the world's leading academic institute in. We have something called Project Narrative here, which has for really 30 years now been the leader in narrative theory. I combine it with neuroscience. And that's the signal innovation. So I think about how does narrative work in the human brain. And unlike a kind of 19th century deductive science where I just have a lot of opinions that I have, we run experiments and we do a mix of what I might call natural history. So natural history is a little bit what Darwin did, where we just look at a huge body of clues in terms of how literature has evolved over time. And then we use that to design small scientific experiments and test our ideas.
When you say experiment, give us an example of what an experiment would look like here. I can picture that in a lab. What does that mean when we're talking about narrative and story?
Well, on the most basic level, and I can give you a couple specific examples, on the most basic level, it means that we identify an element of a story. So, for example, my lab thinks we've identified the element of literature that encourages empathy. We can pull that element out and we can concentrate it in something you read, and we can hit you with a dose of that, and then we can hit a control group with everything else except for that dose. And we can see the levels of forgiveness increase when you remember a recent transgression against you. And we discover that, in fact, it does increase, that this narrative invention makes you more likely to forgive people who have transgressed against you in your life. Other versions of this, I just received a medal from the U.S. Army for leading a research. I've had to make peace with accepting the medal because at first when I got it, I felt very embarrassed. And the Army was like, no, own the medal. So I'm going to own the medal. The U.S. Army did this research where we identified narrative components that help increase your ability to come up with what the Army calls a second plan. So if you're in life and you have a plan or a strategy, life is always going to break that plan or strategy. How quickly can you come up with a second plan? And so we ran a series of experiments in which we gave senior officers 2 hours of training, or I should say the Army ran this study where they gave senior officers 2 hours of training, and they discovered that had a very significant and substantial increase in their ability to come up with second plans. And we've repeated that on students as young as third grade and shown that the big benefit of that is if you go through life knowing you can always come up with a second plan, you always feel a certain sense of resilience and confidence, and you are less prone to anxiety, you're less prone to anger and other kinds of things. So that's an example of what an experiment would look like. And what we do is what I would encourage anyone who enjoys reading to do is to look at books for what's unique about them. So a lot of times, if you read a Hollywood screenwriting guide, you'll be encouraged to look for universal patterns or archetypes. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. Look for what is unique about the characters you like. What's unique about the characters that you like that no other characters have? What's unique about the plot that no other plot? What's unique about the voice or the style of the story? Identify that unique component and then concentrate it and see what the psychological effects are. That's where the innovation comes from. It comes from doing something unique and different, not from doing something generic and universal.
I'm struck by something from the book, and I'll just read it here. It says, the writers we revere, Homer, Shakespeare, Austen, each made a unique technical breakthrough that can be viewed as both a narrative and a neuroscientific advancement. Shakespeare made a neuroscientific advancement.
Yeah. So Shakespeare understood how the brain worked. If you don't,
he wasn't a scientist, though.
He was. Well, he was.
Was he?
Yes. Yeah, so we can debate what a scientist is. Certainly, the term was not coined in the way that we're using it until the 19th century by someone called William Whewell. But if you think of a scientist as someone who has a hypothesis and then runs an experiment, and then is open to modifying their experiment, their hypothesis in response to what happens in the experiment. What does Shakespeare do every night? He comes up with a play. He runs the experiment in front of the audience. Does it work? Does it not work? And what's interesting about Shakespeare is that a regular writer would just be interested in pleasing audiences. And, am I getting a lot of applause? Am I not getting a lot of applause? And there's a long history of that in the theater. And that's why the theater is, I think, an early example of a laboratory, of a place to refine and develop methods and techniques. And by doing so, to understand how humans think and react and behave. Because what you're really studying in that lab is when I put one human on stage and have them interact with another human in this way, how do the group of humans watching these two interacting humans respond? So it's a very kind of psychology type experiment. But Shakespeare isn't just trying to get applause. He is trying to do really interesting things like help his audience process grief or challenge them to think about, can you make meaning after it's been destroyed? So take a play like King Lear. King Lear is a play which destroys all the sort of regular hopes that we might have as an audience coming in. And at the end, even the characters themselves seem demoralized, like they're about to give up. And Shakespeare looks at you and says, can you continue to go on? Can you find a way? Now I've just blown everything up. And you don't get experiments like that happening again until the 20th century in plays like Waiting for Godot and Beckett and Maya Angelou. So he's very, very radical. And that's what I think makes a good scientist, is always pushing the envelope, trying new things, experimenting in the real sense of experimenting, trying something where you don't know exactly what's going to work, but then over time refining it.
You talk about literature as a kind of invention, and we talked about this detective stories as being invented. What's being invented today?
Well, what I can report excitedly is that I don't know. And I think that's the fun thing about the field, is there's always a certain extent to which, as a researcher, you're looking behind and you're able to identify things. But in the moment, it's only the artists and the audience who really know. A professional researcher like me is not going to catch up. And that's why I would encourage people to go out there and themselves do this kind of frontline research, is go see a play that maybe not everyone has heard about before. Support student art. And if you're a student out there, dare to do something different.
I just love it. So you have a book coming out in June of 2023, Story Thinking, the New Science of Narrative Intelligence. And start first with the definition of narrative intelligence.
So the big idea behind the book is that for the last 100 years or so, we've almost entirely defined intelligence as logic. And logic is very powerful. Logic powers all sorts of wonderful things: induction, deduction, interpretation.
It's the basis of AI research, yes?
It's the basis of AI. Well, we can talk about me and AI in a moment, because I have some controversial opinions on that. But as I point out in the book, the human brain, or the ancestors of the human brain, evolved logic about 500 million years ago, but it hasn't propagated to include the whole brain. In fact, less than half the brain, we would think, runs logic. The rest of it is running other mechanisms of intelligence. And what that's telling you is two things. First of all, logic is not by itself adequate. It's very important, or else the human brain wouldn't have it, but it's not itself adequate. And then the question is, well, what are these other mechanisms of intelligence, and what are they doing? And I think this is an important question to your point about AI, because if humans have these other forms of intelligence and AI doesn't, then that starts to highlight for us what is valuable about our brain that we're not going to get from AI. It starts to encourage us to think about human-AI partnerships, and it also encourages us to think about how we're going to train and educate future students, because most of our training is actually teaching students now to think like computers. And if we have computers and computers can do that, well, why don't we focus on these other areas of the brain? And so one of those other areas is narrative intelligence. It's a way of thinking through story. It's story thinking.
We emphasize logic over story, right? How are you defining story then in this context?
So all story is, at its most elemental level, is an event. It's something that happens. And an event and something that happens has two components: a cause and an effect. And the thing that's important about a cause and an effect is they cannot occur at the same time. A cause always has to come before an effect. Now, this causes all sorts of problems for logic. We can talk about the history of David Hume and whatnot, but the main thing with regard to logic is that logic concerns the true. The true is timelessly true. It exists, therefore, in the mathematical present tense. And so everything in logic is always co-occurring at the same time. That's why logic deals in correlation as opposed to causation. And so when you start getting into logic, what logic does is logic breaks cause and effect into cause equals effect. So smoke equals fire, fire equals smoke, this kind of thing. And that makes sense in terms of semiotics.
The study of signs.
The study of signs, yeah. But it doesn't make sense in terms of physical science, because if I were to say to you, well, smoke could equal fire or fire could equal smoke, well, it makes a big difference to you whether or not fire comes from smoke or smoke comes from fire. And so what narrative does and what narrative intelligence allows us to do is sequence events. And therefore, it allows us not to do pattern recognition, but process recognition. And it allows us to see the mechanisms through which things occur. It allows us to think in terms of action as opposed to simply in terms of truths and equations. And it originates in our brain largely in the motor cortex. And a lot of it is non-conscious. So when you're moving your hands, or if you're a pianist and you're inventing new music, or if you're a surgeon and you're dealing with a particularly tricky incision, you're not conscious of a lot of the small movements you're making, but you're still doing them intelligently. And so what has happened is that a lot of our narrative intelligence actually exists in a form of what we might think of as motor intelligence or modo, and it rises up to the level of consciousness when we think in plots and plans and other narratives, other stories. And so what I talk about in the book is this distinction between non-conscious motor intelligence or modo and conscious story thinking, and the way in which when we're making a plan or a plot, we're using narrative intelligence consciously. And obviously when we're reading literature, which is story-driven, that's giving us new stories that we can use to then kind of feed into the way that we think. And that's why literature should be analyzed not the way that I was doing it, like a computer would in terms of its themes and representations only, but also what are its characters doing and what are their psychologies and what are their motives and what are the laws that govern the different worlds that they inhabit and how do different kinds of plots work. And those are all features of story thinking that expand that capacity of our intelligence and allow us to do things that AI can't.
I ask this question of my students all the time. Can AI read, or at least read the way you and I read?
It can't read the way that we read, but it can read language. And what's odd is that AI can read the way that students are taught to read. So we teach reading now in a very reductive way, which is that we teach reading almost entirely as just language elements and close reading them for meanings and patterns and whatnot. But an AI can't imagine an action. So if you were to give an AI Hamlet, it could tell you, oh, well, this word occurs there, and this word is associated with those words, and it can make all these word patterns and word clouds, and it can extract themes and representations, all these kinds of things we're taught to do in English classes. But it could never speculate on why Hamlet did something or why he didn't do something. It could never say, well, here's what might happen next after Horatio leaves the stage. It can never do any of that kind of work. And so I think what is interesting from the fact that GPT, and I should say I have a fair amount of work in AI. I've worked for a lot of AI companies and done a lot of work there. What we're seeing in the ability of GPT to perform a lot of assignments is really not so much a credit to GPT as an indictment on the assignments. And we want to encourage students to do things that are more original and more challenging and more thoughtful and get out of this old view of reading as simply regurgitating facts or data or just making an interpretation, and instead encouraging us to do this deeper psychological work that is natural and intuitive to the generations who produced it.
We began this conversation by talking about AI and logic. Is there anybody working in AI that's trying to train or otherwise devise AI to think in story?
Oh, yes. Well, this is why I got brought in. So they're trying, for at least 10 years now, probably longer, they've been trying to use these natural language processors to do narrative, because that would be the computer that takes over the world. Mm-hmm. First of all, what that computer would do, it would allow Hollywood to fire all of its screenwriters. And you would just have this amazing computer that was producing scripts, and it would be wonderful for the studios. And then beyond that, because it could make up those plots, it could then make up a plot to take over the world. And then it would make that plot, and it would create a science fiction story, which would then enact itself, and it would become Lord of all of us. So, yes. Because language and narrative are different, though, these systems are never going to happen. And so what has actually happened over the last 2 years or so is I've started working with groups. Maybe I can't talk too much about this. It's a little sci-fi-ish, but it does involve parts of the government. It involves places like MIT. And we've started to think, what different hardware would you need to make for a machine to process narrative? And so what you could imagine, and it can be built because our brain is a machine, you could build a different kind of machine that's not a computer that creates stories. But that machine would still run up against the same limit that we have in our head, which is that there's no ultimate story. There's no right story. There's no wrong story. The difference between narrative and truth is that there is a timeless truth, but narratives exist to give us behavioral flexibility. They exist to allow us to come up with different ways of acting in situations that we haven't seen before. And you get into trouble as a species and as an individual when you start thinking that a certain narrative is true as opposed to thinking that it's possible. And so when you see the negative effect of, say, a conspiracy theory or the way that our politics is working now, people have really glommed onto the idea that a particular narrative is true. Data can be true. A narrative can never be true in that sense. It can be falsifiable. It can be wrong. It can be useful or useless. But ultimately what allows us to survive is having many, many, many stories. So if we did build a machine that was able to think in story, all it would really do is just come up with lots and lots and lots of interesting ideas. We'd still have to test them. It wouldn't be able to predict the future or take over the world.
What are you working on now? What's your next project?
Well, in addition to that machine, what I'm doing is I'm working a lot now with U.S. Special Operations to develop training to build up those narrative parts of the brain, to increase things like resilience, to increase things like creative thinking and creative problem solving. And then we're taking all of that information, all of that training, and we're giving it to third graders. And what we're seeing in schools now is for the last 30 years, we've known that the longer kids stay in school, the less creative they get. Because they're encouraged to answer multiple choice questions. They're encouraged.
Take the test.
Yeah, exactly. And what we want to do is we want to start to encourage them, no, answer your own problems. Let's start to bring problems into the classroom that teachers don't know the answer to. Let's start giving you the tools to explore those questions. And so we have developed this training with some of these very elite units, and we're now showing that it has the same power on young minds and young brains to help empower them to be independent and autonomous and solve their own problems. And Ohio State is collaborating with a number of local public school districts, including Worthington schools, to run this training. And my real hope is that in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we will have trained these kids to be so good at solving their own problems that we don't need special operations anymore. And the Army and war will be a thing of the past.
Angus Fletcher, thank you.
Thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dengler. I'm Jen Farmer.